Well, we are back at this white horse. We have not proceeded to the other horses and the riders because there is so much going on with this particular horse that has not been elucidated previously. What we're going to do is we're going to continue looking at this white horse dynamic and this rider on this white horse that is supposed to be coming from this vision from this entity known as John. Now, again, there are some deceptive dynamics going on with respect to this white horse and perhaps with the other horses also. Now, what we see with this particular horse is that there are some dynamics that go along with both the horse and the rider that are significant. It's just so very interesting that someone would be having a vision such as this purportedly so long ago. And so, when looking at this deconstruction of this white horse and this rider, it's important to look at the English, the Greek, the Latin, and the Hebrew in understanding the nature of this white horse or the identity of this white horse, and also what is apparently being articulated about the rider. Now, we're not going to be doing a bunch of esoteric deep dives for this. We're just going to be doing basic exegesis. And so we are just looking at the words and the constructs that are going along with this dynamic, and they are profound, quite frankly. And so we've already looked at some dynamics related to this white horse and what the white horse was carrying. But now we have a little bit more insight about the white horse itself, the nature of the white horse, and the nature of the entity that is being carried by the white horse or the rider of the white horse. And so we're going to look at some of that. There's a lot to this, and so it's broken off into sections in order to be able to understand the various pieces related to this white horse and this rider of the white horse. And so, again, we're not going to get esoteric here. This vision, this whole dynamic for the book of Revelation, it's already esoteric. And so we don't need to be esoteric. And so we're going to be really looking at these very manifest dynamics versus latent dynamics. And the manifest dynamics are actually quite significant. So, with respect to this horse, we're looking at this construct of a horse and what a horse is all about. What does a horse do? And what we find with respect to the horse and the rider is this dynamic of a messenger. And so that's what this horse and this rider represent in part in this particular narrative. This horse appears in this vision and is carrying an entity. And then the entity has this purpose. And so, what do we mean by this horse being a messenger and the rider being a messenger? Another word for messenger is a runner, a courier, a dispatch, a herald, and an envoy. And when you look at this narrative in the book of Revelation, Revelation 6, you see all of these bits and pieces coming together with respect to this heralding dynamic, this entity that is being dispatched, this entity that serves as an envoy. What's not readily apparent is what this thing is actually representing. What is the nature of this horse? What is the nature of the rider? Now we have what the rider is carrying or possessing, but we don't necessarily have a clear understanding of the nature of the horse and the nature of the rider. And remember, the book of Revelation is about revealing something. And so oftentimes individuals will assert that things going on in the book of Revelation are coming from the entity known as Jesus, which is interesting because the entity known as Jesus has already been revealed. And so the question about the book of Revelation is, what exactly is being revealed in the book of Revelation? Now, notably, another word for messenger or this herald, this dispatch, is angel. And so here we have this entity, both the horse and the rider, representing this dynamic of angel. And of course, in the book of Revelation, you see these angelic manifestations in the narrative, in the discussion. And so here we see another dynamic related to this messenger type of situation with the horse and the rider. Now, we're not going to get into a deep deconstruction in this moment related to what has been observed related to this horse and this rider. But what we do know when looking at this is that with respect to this sort of angel, this messenger is presented in a number of ways. And there are certain words that go along with this messenger. And so this messenger first is the first horse and also the first rider in this particular narrative. And so this horse and rider serve as the head, and this horse and rider serve as the lead, the crown, the corona. So you have a corona horse, corona rider, and of course there's the carrying or the possessing of the crown. And it's a specific type of crown. But we also have this dynamic of this lead and this dynamic of Sar. And remember, Sar has more than one meaning. And so with respect to this idea of the Sar, of the first, the head, the lead, the corona, the crown, horse, the crown, Sar, which would be the crown prince, we have with respect to this angel another adjective. And the adjective is arch or arch. Interestingly, so you have archangel. Interestingly, arch or arch is another word for bow. So we have an archangel and a bow angel. We have a Sar angel. We have a crown angel, a first angel, a head angel, a corona angel. And so we essentially have the same thing going on with the horse that we have going on with this rider. And so you have this Sar horse and rider, this first head lead horse and rider, this arch or arc horse and rider, and this bow horse and rider. Now this is interesting because this also fits in with this description that is given about a particular entity. This entity is understood as a proud, rebellious archangel, also going by the name of Satan or Set. And so now we have a little bit more information or insight about the nature of the horse and the rider in terms of the positioning of these entities. And so we see in the narrative that these entities are first. However, we also see in the descriptions of the entities that they are representing this first dynamic with respect to the bow and the crown, which essentially represent the same thing in many ways, and we'll get into that. The other thing that is noteworthy about this horse is this identity of the horse as a white horse, Lukos. And so we see that this is coming out of the Greek again, and there are a number of words that are used in translations to indicate white. However, there is a psychological dynamic that has been going on with this white construct for a while. And it also relates to the caste system situation that has been set up, wherein all of these entities that have varying degrees of brown skin, from that creamy color all the way to a chocolate color, um, many individuals in between there identifying themselves as white. Now, first of all, the entities are not white in terms of the color. And I encourage people, just like people who need to think again about using this term black, I encourage people who are using this construct of white to describe themselves or define themselves, I encourage them to assess that and assess the extent to which they need to be identified in that way or they want to be identified in that way, because something is being invoked each time that is presented based upon these languages, these Greek dynamics, these Latin dynamics, these Hebrew dynamics. And so something's being invoked, and it might not be something that is as favorable as many people take it to mean, because as soon as we say that this is a white horse, we are saying something very specific about this horse in other languages. And as we were just indicating, when identifying this horse as a Lucifer horse, this horse is being associated with this rebellious archangel identified with Satan, Set, who fell from heaven, according to the narrative. And also Lucifer was understood as this proud, rebellious archangel. Now remember, the archangel is the lead angel, the one that leads the charge. Okay, this is the head. This is the prince. Okay, this is the main one that is out in front, synonymous with this horse. And so not only is the horse represented in terms of the phenotype of the horse as a white horse, the horse, by this representation with this rider and all of this horse and this rider are related to this construct of Satan based upon the very basic description that has been provided about this horse and this rider. And as you already know, another word that is used for white or light is Lucifer. And so when you look at that Luke, we've gone over this before, but when you look at that Luke and that Luce, this is also related to this Lucifer construct, this light bringer, this idea of light, this idea of white. You see this description also being offered by Benjamin Franklin when he is describing what he wants to see manifested in the Americas. And so essentially, when people are identifying themselves as white people, just like when people identify themselves as black people, they are insinuating something, either intentionally or unintentionally. But one of the things that they are asserting is that another way of saying white people would be Lucifer people. Another way of saying white race would be the Lucifer race. And so I'm encouraging people to deal with reality in terms of skin color, in terms of phenotype, and don't just be so quick to latch on to things because there are perceived temporary benefits to latching on to these identities. It's the same thing with people identifying as black. Now, of course, that's much more on the surface. And so people more readily see that there are all sorts of insinuations that are negative related to the crayon color black. And so I just encourage all groups to be in touch with reality. And if you are describing yourself, describe yourself accurately. And there are all sorts of words to describe these various phenotypes without using these dichotomies of black and white. And so there are some questions about why this has taken place, because there are also some other insinuations about people and their race, if you will, and the phenotype. And so here we see again this whole Lucifer dynamic, which refers to this idea of white. So we have essentially a Lucifer horse, okay? And so here you can see this Lukos and this Lucifer, and that's what this horse is. So this is a Lucifer horse. Okay, so this first horse that rides out is not the Jesus horse. People are talking about this is Jesus. This is not the Jesus horse. This is apparently the Lucifer horse, simply by the words that are being used. And then, of course, you have the rider associated with this Lucifer horse. And so the rider is also related to this idea of Lukos and Lucifer. And of course, this is the first rider. Now we're going to look at this rider construct and what the rider is carrying. And so you recall the rider is carrying, or has in the rider's possession, this bow and this crown. And the crown we discussed before is a particular type of crown that really is a crown of conquest. That corona, that wreath, that is a conquest crown. And so it's not clear as to whether this rider who has this crown, which signifies royalty, some forms of nobility, it's not clear whether this particular rider is actually wearing the crown. But the other thing that's not clear is how the rider acquired the crown. The rider just was given a crown, was in possession of a crown. It doesn't actually say given a crown. It's just the rider was in possession of a crown. But the rider is in possession of this victory kind of crown. And so it's not clear as to whether this was a crown that was simply passed down because of inheritance, or whether this is a crown that was acquired based upon supplanting and defeat in some sort of conflict. And so that's not quite clear. However, we do have this rider that is this first rider, this arch rider in this particular narrative. Now we're going to also look at the word that goes along with the rider, and this goes along with what the rider is carrying. And so it's very difficult to separate what the rider is carrying from what the rider is. And we're going to look at that. Now, we are already familiar with the word, the etymology that goes along with bow. And we know that this word bow, in terms of etymology, is tied to the word toxon. And so again, related to toxic. And so just another word for a bow is toxon, toxin, something that's toxic. But what we also find when looking at the rider is that the rider has the same construct going on, because one who carries a bow or possesses a bow has a special identity and a name, and the name goes right along with the bow. They really are not separable. And so the bow and the rider become one and the same. And so we have this toxodi construct for the rider, or this toxodi construct for the rider. That's because the rider is understood as one who carries the bow. And this is the word for one who carries the bow. And it's basically the same thing as the bow, this tox dynamic. Now, here's this interesting notation about this rider or this tox dynamic. In terms of Webster's dictionary, we see that this construct is specifically related, again, going back to Greek, to what are understood as public slaves in ancient Athens of Scythian origin. And so if you recall, the Scythians, they were related to bow carriers. Okay, so these entities, these toxati, were armed with bows and serving as police. And so it's a very interesting narrative that we've got going on with this identity of the rider of the horse, who is not only carrying the bow, but is the bow. And remember, the bow is the toxon. The bow is the toxin. And here we see a little bit more about this etymology of this toxon. And we see that this is coming out of the New Latin, but it's coming again from the Greek again. And you see it here very specifically that this toxates, that this is an archer. Okay, and so an archer is the entity that carries the bow. And so the archer is the one that shoots forth or makes the shot of the bow, of the arrow, of the toxin, of the poison. And so that's what we have with respect to this rider. This rider is an archer. And we're going to look at what this archer construct is all about, because then it goes right back to what we were talking about the positioning of the horse and the positioning of the rider in this narrative. And so we have a couple of things going on here with respect to this crown, this corona that's being carried by this archer, this toxin. But we also see with respect to the words that are used, that this arch construct is related to this idea of ruler. An arch is also a prince and a nasi. And so another way of understanding this rider on this white horse is an archon. And so in terms of Greek history, this archer is archon. And you can see that very clearly in terms of the etymology going on here. And so this rider has a very interesting identity, if you will. And we already see that this particular entity that is riding and this horse, these entities are related to, again, this idea of Lukos and Lucifer. And so now we have this whole archer dynamic that is also, according to some of these narratives, related to Lucifer or Satan. This idea of the archangel, the lead angel, the angel that is taking the charge, that is starting the whole thing off. This construct of archer brings up a number of other issues with respect to this conquering and conquest that is indicated in the narrative. And so what we have with respect to an archer is we don't have an entity that is engaged in necessarily close contact combat. An archer is not one who's dealing with a sword. An archer is not engaged in hand-to-hand combat. An archer, very specifically, is a distance assailant. And so the archer assaults from a distance. And so with respect to this rider who's conquering and set on conquest, the identity of this entity, being an archer, indicates that the conquest or the battle or the fighting is in some way at a distance, because that's the nature of the bow. And so that's what we have with respect to this particular archer. The archer is shooting arrows, or the archer has shot an arrow. However, the archer is, generally speaking, some distance away from that which has served as the target. In this instance, that which would be conquered. Now we're going to deal with some of the very direct translation dynamics related to the archer, the archon. What we see with respect to this rider that is presented as an archer, presented as a bow carrier, is another word, oddly enough, for an archer is rabbi or rabbi. Now, this, of course, is tied to another discussion that we've had about this construct of rabbi or rabbi. We've talked about mag, rob, and rob, mag in reverse. Okay, so we've got mag, rob, and rob, mag. Now, with respect to this archer, interestingly, again, this really is the other word for archer in the Hebrew. And so this archer or this rider is also understood as a rabbi. Now, if you recall, this rob construct is related to something that is great, that is first, that is the head, that is multiple, that is large, that is great. Okay, so this archer is representing all of those things in terms of just the word, the translation that is used here. And then ultimately, with respect to this rider that is an archer, okay, so that's what the rider does. That's what the rider is. The rider is an archer. The rider is a rabbi. We also see in terms of the etymology deconstruction that the word for archer is a bowman. Okay, so in terms of the nature of the man, this is a bowman that is riding this Lucifer horse. And so the first entity that rides out in terms of this vision is the archer, also known as the bowman. And so we have this Lucifer horse, this arch horse, this first lead prince horse, carrying or transporting or heralding the archer. And so this horse is transporting or being controlled by, depending on how you look at this relationship between the horse and the rider. And so this entity that is in control of the horse is Bowman. And so now that we have some of the basics of the identity that is being presented in this book of Revelation for this horse and this rider, we can look at how this deconstruction came about. But we have the basics here in terms of what is being presented in Scripture about this first horse and this first rider. And so, again, of course, with respect to this Bowman identity, we also see that this entity is understood as the toxin man, because Bow is just another word for toxin. And we also see that this Bowman is an archman or an arc man. So this is a lead man. And that is the dynamic that is going on with respect to this horse and this man. This person is presented as a leader, a ruler, the first, the chief that is out front, that is presented first.